This morning, we are joined by over 300 participants from all walks of life, including ministers, deputies, senators, councillors, friends and colleagues from the legal community, business leaders, as well as individuals and representatives from organisations working in the fields of social justice, equality and environmentalism. We are particularly delighted to be joined by Mary Robinson, Adjunct Professor for Climate Justice, Trinity College Dublin, and spoken word artist, Sasha Terfus. Both Mary and Sasha will speak in their own unique way on the topic of environmental justice, and I would like to thank you both for agreeing to be part of our celebrations this morning. To you, the audience, we fully appreciate the time you have taken from your busy schedules to be with us this morning. And so without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Rose Wall, the CEO of Community Law and Mediation, to say a few words on why we are embarking on this new journey and what we hope to achieve. Thank you, Rose.
Thanks for that introduction, Paul. And for those of you who don't know much about Community Law Mediation, or CLM, we're an independent law centre and charity based in Coolock and Limerick, and we've been providing free legal and mediation services to communities experiencing disadvantage since 1975 in areas such as housing, social welfare, employment, equality and child law. And I'm really delighted that we're at the point of launching this Centre for Environmental Justice, and I'm personally delighted to have Mary Robinson with us here today. I think it's worth saying a few words at the outset about the what and the why. To start with the what is environmental justice? Well, it recognises that our world is shared equally by all people, that abuses of the environment, including climate change or poor environmental policies, increase inequalities, and that environmental protection and climate action should also build social equality. Environmental justice ensures that marginalised groups are not disproportionately impacted by climate change or other environmental harms, and that the state's response to environmental challenges is informed by the principles of inclusivity and fairness. The climate crisis is not just an environmental one. It is a health crisis, a housing crisis, a jobs crisis, a debt crisis, and ultimately a human crisis. A crisis that is not being and will not be borne equally by all. So it is a crisis for women, for children, for older people, for members of the travelling community, for those on low incomes, for people with disabilities, because people who are most disadvantaged and marginalised have the fewest choices about where and how they live. They have fewer resources to cope with pollution or the challenges of climate change, and they have less visibility in the shaping of policy responses. Now to the why. In the course of our work in CLM, we have seen how climate change and other environmental factors directly impact people's housing due to flooding or health due to dirty air. We are also alert to the potential unfairness of climate action measures on marginalised groups, whether that is, for example, through job loss or energy poverty. In setting up this centre, we recognise that we must act now to protect our environment and our communities from climate change, and this effort must be done in a way that does not exacerbate existing inequalities. So what will the Centre for Environmental Justice do? Well, it's the first of its kind in Ireland, dealing specifically with cases that relate to environmental justice. We are delighted to welcome Rebecca Keating, our new environmental justice solicitor, to our team. And in the coming months, we will provide legal advice on environmental justice issues through a regular legal advice clinic starting on the 16th of February. We will provide training and information resources on environmental justice to organisations, including a pilot training programme for local development companies around the country. We will partner with DCU in relation to research which will explore the key dimensions of environmental injustice experienced by vulnerable and marginalised communities in Ireland. We will continue our law reform work in this area, informed by the issues we are coming across in our training and advice work. This will include monitoring the progress of the Climate Bill and working with An Taisce looking at the barriers to effective access to justice in environmental matters. And critically, we will, when necessary, use litigation to create effective responses to environmental problems so that the voices of those most impacted are heard and changes are made. This is a key strength and unique aspect of the Centre, particularly when there is currently no legal aid for organisations to take environmental cases to court. Individual cases have the potential to influence important legislative and policy changes that will be key to addressing the core challenges at the intersection of climate change and social inequality in Ireland. From our work in other areas of social justice, we know how important it is to use the law as a means of protecting human rights and progressing equality. The ultimate goal of the Centre for Environmental Justice is to educate, engage and empower communities through the law to build a better, more equal society for all. So what type of issues do we expect to be working on? Well, our focus will be on environmental justice issues that affect marginalised communities. Even though our first clinic is only starting next Tuesday, there are certain issues that have already come to our door. For example, we know that individuals and families living in coastal and flood risk areas whose homes are uninsurable will face an increased risk of flooding every year due to changing weather patterns and projected sea level rise. What is going to happen to these homes and these families' right to adequate and safe housing? Another example is air pollution. We know from the most recent Environmental Protection Agency report that approximately 1,300 people die prematurely in Ireland every year due to poor air quality, with a very recent report putting that global figure at 1 in 5 or 8.7 million. This impacts certain groups more because of where they live, where they can afford to live, the level and quality of healthcare they have access to, or because of existing respiratory problems. It also affects young children who take more breaths and whose shorter height means they are closer to many sources of pollution such as car exhausts. Children's lung capacity can be permanently stunted and their health permanently damaged by exposure to pollutants at a young age. This is clear from the conclusion of a recent inquest in London, which found that air pollution was a cause in the tragic death of a 9-year-old Ella Kissy Deborah, who died of respiratory failure after being exposed to excessive air pollution. We also know from the recent Youth Work Ireland report that 71% of landfill sites and waste incinerators in this country are located in areas that are below the national average of deprivation. We know that energy poverty is a significant issue, made worse by COVID as people are spending more time at home, with those in social and private rented housing, those who are unemployed, one-parent families and members of the travelling community at particular risk. For example, a 2017 MABS report concluded that travellers living in caravans spent 21% more of their income on fuel. We know too that there are barriers to access to justice on environmental matters. For example, while it is crucial that environmental NGOs are empowered to fight for clean air, water and a healthy environment because the environment is unable to speak for itself, and despite the fact that there is a robust legal framework derived from the Aarhus Convention that specifically protects the right of access to justice in environmental matters, there is currently no legal aid available to environmental NGOs seeking access to the courts. This was highlighted recently by Judge Anthony Collins, a judge of the General Court of the European Union, who called for improved access to the court for activists due to the fact that Ireland has historically displayed, in his words, an astonishing reluctance to comply with EU environmental law and only seem to pay attention when taken to court. Lastly, we know that the climate bill, as it currently stands, hasn't got it right. The proposed bill contains no definition of climate justice, no mention of just transition, and weak public participation rules. There is also an opportunity in the bill to look at the Climate Change Advisory Council, a recent independent review of which called for it to move beyond the economic case for climate action and to engage more broadly with the totality of issues involved, such as social cohesion, justice, innovation, and public health. Our casework and law reform work is always ground up. So in addition to all of these issues, there will be many more that will come through our door in the coming months. So why are we doing this now? Well, we have to significantly reduce our emissions and quickly if the 1.5 degree limit in the Paris Agreement is to remain at all feasible. I don't need to tell most of you listening today that going over that 1.5 degree limit will have catastrophic consequences. However, Ireland has consistently underperformed, with recent energy emissions the third worst per capita in Europe. The former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar has labelled Ireland a climate laggard, and the government's own Climate Change Advisory Council has concluded, in its own words, that Ireland is completely off course and described future projections as disturbing. Also, the experience of facing a global health emergency over the past year has shaken our belief that we are powerless in the face of great challenge. There are parallels between the COVID and climate crises. Both have severe health and economic implications. Both have a disproportionate impact on certain groups. And both are examples of the devastation caused by a delayed or inadequate response. COVID has shown quite starkly the idea of same storm, different boats. How certain groups fare worse than others due to vulnerabilities such as poor health, precarious employment or homelessness. And this will increasingly be the case in relation to the climate crisis, a challenge which is much less transient than COVID. The government's initial response to COVID through rent freezes, eviction bans and other measures demonstrates what can be done to protect the most vulnerable, and lessons can be learned from this in how we respond to the effects of climate change and other environmental burdens. Similarly, COVID has demonstrated that social solidarity and cohesion are critical to effective national action and achieving societal change. The Centre for Environmental Justice sees fairness, equality, and listening to the voices of the most vulnerable as a necessary foundation for effective climate action. I'd like to conclude on 2 points. We've been overwhelmed by the level of support we've received since we started looking at setting up the centre, with so many people coming forward to tell us how needed the centre is. And so I would like to thank all of those who have given us the funding, expertise and time, including the panelists here today, to get us to the point where we are launching the centre today. The second is a call to action, because there's only so much that CLM can do on its own. And so I call on individuals and organisations already fighting for social justice for marginalised groups to be aware of that interconnection between climate change and inequality. I call on those same individuals and organisations, on the legal community, on universities and on businesses to support and collaborate with CLM on the work of the centre. I call on those with the means to do so, to financially support CLM's work in the area. And finally, I call on politicians and policymakers attending this event today to work with us to ensure that fairness and justice inform climate action policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rose, for that very clear statement of purpose. And on behalf of the board, I would like to say that we are delighted to be expanding our work into this vital area. We are truly honoured to have Mary Robinson officially launch the Centre for Environmental Justice this morning. I don't think Mary needs much of an introduction, but she certainly deserves a fulsome one. As many of you are aware, Mary Robinson is Adjunct Professor for Climate Justice in Trinity College Dublin and Chair of the Elders. She served as President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997 and UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002. She is a member of the Club of Madrid and the recipient of numerous honours and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President of the United States, Barack Obama. Between 2013 and 2016, Mary served as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy in 3 roles. First for the Great Lakes region of Africa, then on climate change, and most recently as a Special Envoy on El Niño and climate. Her foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice, established in 2010, came to a planned end in April 2019. Mary's book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience and the Fight for a Sustainable Future, was published in September 2018. This morning, Mary will share her perspectives on the importance of environmental justice, and I invite Mary now to address our audience and formally launch our centre. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to take part in the launch of this timely Centre for Environmental Justice, and I congratulate Community Law and Mediation for once again being ahead of the field. And I want to emphasise the word timely. In many ways, Rose Wall has already done this, because it is being recognised more and more that we cannot address the threat of the climate crisis or achieve sustainable development top-down alone. We do need the right policies and the funding to be aligned with staying at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in the future. But we also need bottom-up, community-based approaches. Tackling environmental justice at local level, as we've heard in some detail from Rose Wall, is the best way to try to reduce inequalities. And those inequalities are very real, and as she said, have been exacerbated by COVID. COVID is almost like a mirror in linking those inequalities as well, and showing us the intersectionality, a great feminist word, between gender injustice, poverty injustice, racial injustice, injustice if you're marginalized, if you're somebody with disabilities, whatever. There is a connection, and at local level, that too can be brought out. A number of you will have heard me talk about the layers of injustice that I've identified over time, at least 5, that require a climate justice approach. I've learned from the great John Hume himself to keep repeating your core message. So I'm going to just briefly repeat those five layers, because I think they frame the levels at which we need to address, and then take that to the local level, as this new centre will do. First of all, the injustice that the climate crisis, and I'll keep calling it that because that's what it is, a crisis. The climate crisis disproportionately and earlier affected the poorest countries and communities, and still disproportionately affects those in poorer communities, even in developed countries. And they're less responsible for the problem, or in some cases not at all responsible for emissions. The second layer is the gender dimensions within that. And we see that also with COVID, that it disproportionately affects women in unemployment because of their care responsibilities for children or for the elderly, and so on. The third layer is the one that children in Ireland and around the world have been calling us out on, the intergenerational injustice. And I'm very affected by that myself, with my 7 grandchildren ranging in age from 17 to 6 months. So, you know, thinking about the fact that they'll be in their 30s and 40s in 2050 and share the world with a much larger population. And if we don't get things right now, what kind of world would that be? The fourth layer is a subtle one, but it's one in Ireland we have to take into account because it's our responsibility in relation to developing countries. The different pathways to development. We built our economy on fossil fuel, like the rest of the industrialized world. Now we have to wean ourselves off more quickly than we're doing, because we still, as Rose Wall said, have a higher level of emissions per head, much too high. And so we all have to be part of the need to reduce our emissions. But developing countries need to take their populations out of poverty, and they will need the clean energy and the clean technology and the jobs and the training to do that. And we haven't shown enough solidarity. The fifth layer is a really important one, and I want to emphasize it because, if anything, it's the one that possibly hasn't come out enough in relation to the positioning of this new centre, and that is the injustice to nature herself. And we know now that we need nature-based solutions, that we have a convention on biodiversity in China this year, which will emphasize the links that need to be made. I think far more links need to be made between the IPCC and its guidance on climate and the Convention on Biodiversity, talking about, and I'm part of a campaign for nature, and we're trying to say that we need to protect 30% of the land and 30% of the oceans of the world, and really emphasize biodiversity, really emphasize reforestation, etc. And I think this is something that's very relevant locally. So I would encourage, you know, bringing that to country level. I was very pleased to hear Rose Wall reference that report about the health impacts of fossil fuels, and that 1 in 5 people in the world today die because of fossil fuel pollution. Actually, yesterday I participated in a Fearless Women webinar like this. It's a group that I've been party to, and one of the members of the group, Ellen Dorsey of the Wallace Foundation, had been a funder of that research, and we talked about it a little. You might try Ellen Dorsey of the Wallace Foundation for future support, and I have another suggestion about funding before I finish. I was very pleased to see that the centre is building its capacity through good collaborations, for example, with the Irish Local Development Network, with Antashka, with the legal profession, as has been mentioned. And I was going to encourage collaboration with the newly formed Task Climate Justice Centre, but I gather that's already happening. That Task Climate Justice Centre is being managed by a former colleague of mine in my Centre for Climate Justice, Sean McCabe. This is going to be such an important year. I just want to speak about it a little bit. We know that this is the year, postponed from last year, when we're working towards the COP26 in Glasgow in the first 12 days of November. Ireland has to be part of an increase in ambition of our nationally determined contribution. We have to also get our private sector engaged in the way that the private sector internationally is engaging more and more. I don't think the Irish private sector is doing enough, and I hope that it will commit to be zero carbon by at the latest 2050 and work backwards to what that means. I want to briefly talk about the lessons of COVID, and then I want to come on to another source of both funding and activity for the centre. The lessons from COVID are at least 4 lessons that we can think about. First of all, that collective human behavior actually matters, because that's what's protecting us from the virus at the moment. The fact that we're in lockdown, we're socially distancing, we're washing our hands, all that. We need more collective behavior to address how to live sustainably. And this centre can help locally with that. How do we reduce our waste? How do we recycle more carefully? How do we think about our diet, for that matter? You know, all of this is also part of what the centre can encourage. The second lesson is that government matters. And we're seeing the listening we're doing to the health experts in Ireland. They're leading government policy rightly because they know what needs to be done. We need the same attention to the climate scientists as we go forward. The third lesson is listening to the science. The fourth lesson is, and it's an interesting one, I think there's more compassion now. I think in Ireland, but also all around the world, I'm hearing about more openness to the other who's suffering more awareness, because we're all out of our comfort zone, and more thought about our fragility as a human species. You know, that this tiny virus that we can't even see can so devastate economies all around the world, health all around the world, deaths all around the world. And it's kind of brought about some kind of empathy and solidarity, which certainly was not there before. And I think we should build on this. And I think it's, you know, it's a positive factor that we need empathy. And at local level, this centre is going to be all about an empathy for those who need to be prioritized. And you've mentioned those, Rose, very well, who need that priority. So let me come now to another possibility for the centre. The EU has talked about a climate pact, but I don't think it has become a reality yet. It's an initiative inviting people, communities, and organizations to participate in climate action and build a greener Europe. But I think at the moment it's rhetoric. I don't think it has actually happened enough. And I think that this new centre could be a kind of force for implementation. I think you could contact the EU Climate Pact, whatever section it's in, and I'm sure you can find that pretty easily, and get some funding for being a leader, a thought leader on the EU Climate Pact. How about that? So you're local, but you're also a thought leader on what's happening at the European level, because it's not happening. It's certainly not happening enough. So that's my my final funding thought for you. And I'm really delighted that after me, we're going to have a poem that I listened to called My Promise, which will be read by Sasha Turfus. It's a lovely poem because it begins rather grimly, as it should in many ways. There's a lot to be worried about, especially as a young person. But then it comes on to something I feel very strongly about, and that is hope. And I love the way that it transitions to words of hope, because and refuses to indulge the negative side, because I think that's what we all have to do. We have to have hope. We're in a very difficult time. We're in the middle of this awful, endless lockdown that seems to go on forever, but actually vaccines are coming on stream. We have to have hope. We have to come out of this with a much greener future-facing Ireland. I don't like, actually, the UN Build Back Better. There's something wrong with it, because it's build back, and that gives the people impression that we want to go back. We don't. We want to go forward with equality and fairness. And that's the way I see it. And that's how we have to build forward, with equality and fairness. And then we will have a better world. So thank you very much. And I look forward to my promise.
Thank you, Mary, for those inspiring words, and also for the challenge. We look forward to being European leaders, not just national leaders in this domain. We'll now close the event with a performance, as Mary said, by spoken word artist Sasha Terfus. Sasha has performed as part of the Female Tribes project and at Electric Picnic, Other Voices, All Together Now, the Dublin Fringe Festival, and alongside the RTE Concert Orchestra. Sasha will perform her piece, My Promise, a work which she was commissioned to write by Green Schools Ireland for Clean Air Week in 2020. Over to you, Sasha.
When my children's children ask what we did to stop it, I will barricade my words behind my tongue. I will hold them tight like coins and bury them under my mattress or in a safety deposit box. I will lock them away. There were as many possibilities as there were gods, but we placed our faith in copper and assumed someone else would find the balance. We thought we knew the price of ignorance, but we didn't know how much exactly it would cost us. When they ask how much time we had left, I will tell them that much like our bloodline, the gas has always been there. With each birth of a generation, it grows and expands. With each exhale, you could taste the thickness of the air, how it lingered like the fumes of a car. The scent of stale smoke stinging our nostrils, we watched as the seas began to bubble and the trees began to smolder, until there was nothing left of us but ash and char. I do not want to tell them of how we ignored the warnings and let their future crumble by the curbside, of how we lived each day in fear, checking extinction after extinction off the list, waiting for us to be the final victims, surrendering ourselves to the ultimate symptom of our own existence. Instead, I want to speak to them of hope. I want to tell them of the fight in our bones, and of how we screamed our climate, our future from the top of our lungs. I want them to learn how to barricade streets with their bodies and challenge ignorance with their intellect. I want them to know they were given a chance. I want their possibilities to flourish. I want them to know they are worthy of a world that is kind and plentiful. They will have as much time as they need, not what they were allocated. To live is the most glorious adventure of them all. It is up to you to learn of its excitement, for this planet is more than a lump of mass. It is a nirvana suspended in enchantment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. What an incredibly powerful piece upon which to end our celebrations this morning. May I sincerely thank Mary Robinson for launching our new centre and Sasha for her wonderful performance. And finally, may I thank you all for your attendance and interest in this really important initiative, and we look forward to working with many of you in the near future. Thank you all, and take care.